So happy to see you on our Tea Time Tuesday. Beginning to let ourselves settle wherever we are in our position on our couch or chair. Having great gratitude to the Buddha, to the Dhamma, and to the Sangha. Paying homage to that ability to really awaken, to let go of our suffering, to see it clearly, as was discovered by the Buddha and taught in his teachings. So we have the Buddha, we have the Dhamma, the truth of the way things are, the truth that we can feel directly into, the nature of human birth, the nature of things being impermanent, and perhaps the nature of our clinging to hopes that things would be different. And great gratitude to the Sangha, our own Sangha, as well as many generations of lay people, nuns and monks, who have passed on their interpretation of the teachings of the Buddha. The ones we tend to dwell upon the most in the Pali translations, the sort of turn of the century, Victorian age kind of language, but nonetheless well studied, passed on from generations before that. And so we can have gratitude as well as really paying homage to this opportunity and to ourselves for making it important to come together, to spend this time being with the body and the mind just the way it is right now. Letting go of thoughts about the future, releasing thoughts about the past as they arise. Most thoughts are about the future and about the past. And we can just notice ourselves waking up when we catch ourselves in a long thought pattern. And as we sit with the way things are right now, with mindfulness being present, we may notice different things going on in our bodies. As we settle a little, sometimes those subtle aches and pains show themselves. And we may notice as we really accept them, embrace them, and be with them for a moment or two, they may change. Sometimes things are more intense and less intense. Sometimes they stay for a while due to conditions, or they dissipate or move somewhere else. Just giving us that direct understanding that there is nothing to hold on to, and we can see clearly with direct experience that Anything that arises due to conditions comes to one of our sense doors. We hear it, see it, smell it, taste it, touch it, think about it. It's impermanent. And we understand this not by thinking about it, but by directly experiencing it, staying with the moment. And if it's hard to do that because the mind is going all over the place, we can choose a single object of the breath at the nostrils or at the diaphragm, or the sitting point of the buttocks on the cushion, or the touch point of the hands, a place that lets our attention go to a single object without getting too lost in all the other sense doors receiving information. We can narrow our gaze at first. And we can hold ourselves kindly and gently in this practice, letting the container of our body hold us, letting gravity be our anchoring, encouraging our hearts to be open to whatever experience arises. as we keep our attention on the breath or the pressure at the belly or the breath coolness or warmth at the nostrils, we can just remind ourselves gently to come back here from time to time as we notice ourselves lost in perhaps sensation in the body or something happening in the mind that carries us away from the present moment. We can just bring ourselves gently back to this moment and to this moment and to this moment. We may notice elements in the body of the solidity, the solid feeling of earth in our bones, in our weight on the cushion. We can notice the water of our blood, our saliva, various water elements in the body. We can have these material forms that we're noticing of air in the body, air coming through the lungs, fire, the fire of the digestive system. We have all of these elements that are coming together. And we have perception and the mental formations, and we have consciousness, and they all constitute this kind of psychophysical complex that we put the label on as a being or a personality. And what we can discover as we're sitting is over and over again the truth of impermanence, that none of those can we cling to. And that, in short, as the Buddha discovered, this kind of clinging to these aggregates is suffering. Without that being any kind of a negative judgment feeling, it's just a truth, a Dhamma. We see that suffering occurs when we attach to some part of the form that we call ourselves. And this is just investigation that we're doing to see clearly. The elements arising and passing, we pay attention to them. We can notice that there's earth and air and fire and water throughout the body. And so we don't need to ruminate about the past or try to plan for the future when we're having a formal sitting time. We can just be exactly with what is arising. We can build concentration with the single object of the breath or the sit point. Always returning there if we find the mind racing out in a few different directions. Gently and kindly holding ourselves with compassion, returning again to the present moment. We make an attempt to still the body and quiet the mind, or at least mindfulness and awareness are present when we feel the need to move. We can notice, there is some craving happening there. We want something to happen next. And there might be some action, but before that, between that craving and that action, we can notice the intention. Sometimes we can slow down our attention to move by that noticing and even investigating what's happening there in that moment before we move. And ultimately, if movement happens, we notice it fully. A rising of energy, a rising of intention, creation of an action. seeing clearly as conditions come together. There may be any number of the hindrances that can arise. We can notice if there's tiredness, if there's anxiousness and restlessness, if there is doubt, or if we're grasping at something or pushing it away. We can just see it come and go through the heart-mind space. And knowing that these are unskillful mind states, as best we can, we let them go and come back to the present moment. Sometimes if they persist, we can have a remedy of standing up if we're tired, or letting the concentration begin again on the single object that we've chosen. Letting the mind roam more toward the Dhamma, toward what we know as the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path that we've been studying. The Brahma Viharas of kindness and compassion, joy and equanimity. And being with what arises when anxiousness arises, or perhaps there's challenges happening. We can see it fully, hold it gently, and say, I see you, like the Buddha had to do with Mara. Mara, I see you. All those 10,000 things that were being thrown at him to divert him from his purpose of being free. We have lots that comes into our hearts and minds that wants to pull us away, get our attention. And they do for a while. And we can just say, Mara, I see you. Acknowledging it, however long it lasts. The acknowledgement is a step toward freedom. And we just begin again. Sometimes we rearrange our posture a little with awareness, or we may open our eyes to let light in if we're tired. Or we might have the intention again as we begin again to stay mindful and aware of what's happening, what's rising, how long it lasts. Can we notice it when it leaves? Or when do we wake up in a moment? Are we noticing something because it's leaving? Can we notice something as it arises? This kind of investigation, this kind of clarity in our awareness is the kind of wisdom that's needed to know when we can turn away from something that's not healthy for us and when we can turn toward something that is skillful, a skillful mind state. Mindfulness is neutral and sees what arises. Awareness is present and wisdom brings that clarity to skillful and unskillful mind states arising. How is the breath being present with it? It might be different than when we started. Are we noticing now that it's short or long, or is it heavy or light? How is the pressure on our buttocks? Is there warmth or coolness, tingling sensations? Being present in the body. As we settle, we may still be aware of the senses of hearing, or maybe there's some internal seeing going on, tasting, touching, just noticing the senses. Everything that we observe comes to us through our senses. And that's how we solidify our world. And we know on the relative level. This is how we create ourselves, our desires and our dislikes, but we also know on the bigger picture, as we are discovering breath by breath, that nothing can be called me or mine. Nothing can be clung to. The relative level, we define ourselves and get along in our lives, and in the absolute level, we see one breath at a time. Everything arises and passes away. And we don't philosophically think about this. We touch into it, one breath at a time, one moment of awareness at a time. Noticing what might seem pleasant or what might seem unpleasant. Or when we might be confused, unclear, we can't tell. And in our being present, we can discover for ourselves. We have the privilege of having had the Sakyamana Buddha go before us as our teacher. He himself found this out for himself without a teacher. And we can discover the truth of this universal suffering. And we can notice the truth of the origin of suffering. That clinging and craving something or pushing something away. And we can know that there is a cessation to suffering. The Buddha found this and became enlightened. And he let us know about the path that that others created upon his teachings, that he created and spoke about over and over again. The Eightfold Path. And as we notice each breath that arises, or each thought that comes and goes, we can notice that if we cling to it, grasp onto it, we create suffering for ourselves. We can notice the 5 aggregates, but we're present with them without judgment about it, just realizing that all of these things are impermanent, but they are ways that we can see clearly in this relative human existence. And so we hold ourselves balancing the grief, the dukkha of life. We can see clearly that craving is the cause that brings stress into our lives. One of the phrases in the Dhammapada that I like, cutting the roots of craving, if its root remains undamaged and strong, a tree, even if cut, will grow back. So too, if latent craving is not rooted out, this suffering returns again and again. Encircled with craving, people hop round and round like a rabbit caught in a snare. Tied with fetters and bonds, they go on to suffering again and again for long. For a person forced on by his thinking, fierce in his passion, focused on beauty, craving grows all the more. Here's the one who tightens the bond, but one who delights in the stilling of thinking, always mindful, cultivating a focus on the foul. He's the one who will make an end, the one who will cut Mara's bonds. And this actually brings the joy in the practice, the uplifting of our hearts, because we have the opportunity to see this clearly, moment to moment. We may notice if we have judgments about what we see. How does that affect us? We can be involved in those necessary sense involvement in the world, but not attached. We want to notice as clearly as we can that what comes to the eye, what comes to the nose, what comes to the tongue, the body, the intellect, all of these forms and sounds and smells, tastes and tactile sensations, all of these consciousnesses at the eye and the perception, and that these can be seen as arising and passing. This is where craving arises, where it dwells, and where we can see it fall away. And through all of this, we hold ourselves in kindness and in gentleness, noticing what happens in the mind. When we are happy, when we grieve, when we have subtle happiness of sukha. This mindfulness is such a great gift, along with investigation and wisdom. May we hold ourselves in so much kindness and so much appreciation. For seeing directly what arises, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant. And may we let this kind of kindness flow to others. To whomever you choose, be it a teacher or a friend. Encircling this being with kindness, well-being. May they have happiness, the causes of happiness. May they be free from suffering and danger. May they have happiness, the causes of happiness. And may they find compassion for themselves as we find compassion for them. May you be free from your suffering. As we envision and hold in our hearts the teacher or the friend. Whatever that feeling is for you, whether it's sensations in your body or perhaps thoughts, the phrases that work for you, or a word or two, or just a feeling, including in our sphere another person, a friend, a teacher, a child, an animal. That we can awaken this kindness and thoughts of well-being in our hearts. That we may soften our hearts. That we may include ourselves and others in this letting go of ill will. including also in the circle of our hearts, a neutral person or a group of neutral people, whatever comes first into your heart and mind. Wishing in gladness and well-being that they be free from harm, free from danger. Whether it's your postman or someone that delivered your groceries or somebody at the grocery store, or whether it's large groups of people in difficulty and challenges, or those caught in violence, those that are homeless, those who have tremendous suffering happening in their homes and in their families. Whatever comes to us that can be a neutral person or a neutral group, may we let this kindness and compassion that gets nurtured and developed in our hearts and minds include others in suffering. That we don't fall into apathy or cruelty. We let go of ill will and allow our hearts to stay open, even in these challenging, difficult times, taking care of ourselves as we need to, letting that kindness envelop us first and letting it flow to others, to those beings that are in pain and in sorrow, to those beings that are in joy and gladness, to those known and unknown, to beings that swim and crawl and fly and walk in this realm and in other realms. May all beings everywhere know happiness and the causes of happiness, be free from harm. Anicca vata sankara upadavaya domino upakitava meruchanti te samvapasamo sukho. All conditioned things are subject to impermanence. They arise and pass away. And seeing this clearly brings the greatest happiness, which is peace. May the goodness of this practice be of benefit to all beings. Noticing with mindfulness what happens as you think a little more, noticing the breath. How does it change? Noticing as you perhaps open your eyes slowly and really with mindfulness let light come in. Begin to see shapes and forms, letting some of that heart energy stay open to each other in our circle. And I thought for some of our conversation today, I would continue on a little bit in what I started a tad in our sitting as sort of a reminder of the Four Noble Truths. that, as we know, the Buddha lived in northern India during the 6th and the 5th centuries BC, and the word Buddha itself means the awakened one, or the enlightened one. And, the prince, who eventually became Gautama Buddha, was confronted with the realities of life that we see all the time around us when we acknowledge them. Sickness and old age and death. And he didn't see these in his life until he was 29 years old. And following these experiences, he became disenchanted and took to the homeless ascetic life in search of why humans are suffering. And for 6 years, he searched for this way out of human suffering. And he chose different paths of asceticism and of, as he was surrounded by sensual pleasures in his princely home. But eventually, as we mentioned, when we just had the May full moon, that while meditating on the mindfulness of breathing, Anapanasati Sutta, which you hear me referring to quite a bit, as well as the Satipatthana Sutta that we've been studying, that at the ripe young age of 35 years old, he attained realization. And he saw for himself, and he began his speaking to the 5 ascetics that were the friends of his before he went off on his own. And his very first sermon was called The Turning of the Wheel of Truth. And that's when, of all the things he could have talked about through those years of discovery and through those awakening moments, what's the first thing he says? The truth of being born is suffering. Aging is suffering. Illness is suffering. Death is suffering. Sorrow, lamentation, grief, pain, and despair are suffering. These are, everything we come into contact as being born human. And that we're connected with, with what we dislike, and then that's suffering. And separated from what we like, that's suffering. And, not getting what we want is suffering. So, in short, those 5 aggregates of clinging are suffering. Clinging to the material form, clinging to feelings and perceptions. We've talked about the 5 aggregates briefly in the past, and this is what creates the origin of the rising of suffering. And that this craving for sense pleasures and this kind of craving for becoming or existing, and also this craving for non-existing. So these are called the 3 types of craving. And there's many, words in the Buddhist teachings, and there's no real direct translation for the Pali term of Tanha into English. So it's basically been translated as thirst or craving, longing or desire. Those are, some of the words. And that we can never be satisfied. Those are sort of the common descriptions about it. And, there can also be desire sometimes for positive and wholesome actions as well. And sometimes there's an element of selfishness that's contained in the Pali word of Tanha. Sometimes it's regarded by some scholars as the word craving is, kind of more suitable than desire or thirst somehow. But that's what the Buddha described on his first sermon, that the origin of suffering is craving. That we crave for sense pleasures and an existence that we might have these latent tendencies of also wanting to not exist. So it includes not only the desire to seek happy and pleasant experiences and the desire to avoid unhappy and unpleasant experiences, but also there's attachments to ideas and beliefs and theories and opinions. And it's just the nature of craving that any satisfaction received is just temporary and doesn't last. And it might increase our desire to seek more and more similar experiences. And if there's any obstacles to fulfilling them, then we develop anger or hatred or, even things as we know and see in life, that people resort to verbal and physical violences in order to fulfill the craving. And so in these kinds of craving, there's long explanations about them. But, and I know, Margaret, you wanted to talk a little bit about this. And so we'll bring it up for now and have some conversation. But this can be a much more delved into conversation. But there's craving for sense pleasures, kama tanha. And it's the intense desire for sensual pleasure from the objects that we receive through the six sense doors. That sense pleasure through the ear, the eye, the nose, the mouth, the tongue. And it's even craving of thoughts and ideas through the mind. Those are a little harder to see sometimes. Craving for sense pleasures includes desires for sense objects and even wealth and power, and also the desire for ideas and views and opinions and theories and beliefs. And so, on the one hand, we need to form our ideas and views and beliefs to help us get through our life, but we also need to notice when we are attached to theories and opinions and ideas, and sometimes we're not always open to listening or just opening our hearts to other ones. And there's also this craving for, there's three of them, but there's craving for becoming or existence, bhavatanha. Bhavatanha. It's a craving for becoming. It's a craving to become something or someone in this life, as well as the urge to continue to exist in future lives. And it's associated really with wrong view of life being an eternal and immortal kind of entity. And it includes also that craving to be happy or rich or famous or powerful or popular, all, as well as the craving to attain spiritual attainments. And, maybe wanting to be reborn in a higher, happier plane of existence. So it's called craving for existence, and it's related to the belief that it's a belief in the ego, that there's an absolute and eternal self, and that somehow that's independent of the mind and matter, and it has a capacity to survive eternally through transmigration from one birth to the next. And so this craving for existence might be considered a desire to be maybe born in a sensuous world or in a fine material plane, or even in formless places. It's a kind of desire for existence. And then there's craving for non-becoming. It's like the opposite. Confused yet? There's craving for non-becoming and craving for a non-existence of the self, or annihilation is the desire to get rid of something, the desire to not exist after death. And one of, some people might crave to be rid of anything that you don't want to cope with, like unbearable physical or mental distress, pain, anxiety, worry, suffering, anger, hatred, jealousy, bad health, unpleasant situations or people. And so craving for non-existence can be associated with the wrong belief in what, especially during the Buddha's time period, there was a whole group of people that there was annihilation. And so it's the belief in the presence of the ego identity that's identical with the mind and matter, and it will be completely annihilated at the time of death and no possibility of a rebirth. Sometimes people will contemplate suicide or an act of self-harming. It could indicate an extreme form of craving for non-existence. Whatever the craving of a person who commits suicide is, as long as the ingredients for rebirth, like ignorance or craving about the karmic energy that can be present, there's a rebirth that most possibly might be in an unhappy realm. Because in the Buddhist ideas, taking one's own life is also considered an unwholesome volitional action. And of course, in our day and age, this is interesting conversation for, death with dignity and things like that. But there is the annihilation theory. It's known as nihilism, and a person might go after every object of sensual pleasure that they're able to get a hold of in order to enjoy their life to the fullest without any care as to how they attain their pleasures. And then they may not hesitate to commit numerous unwholesome evil actions on others and on themselves because they believe that they won't have to face any undesirable circumstances of the actions after their death. So here we've got, hang on, Bob. So here we've got these, different forms of craving. There's even the desire to perform meritorious acts. So, in the long run, what we're looking at is attachment and craving, and seeing that clinging, as he described in his Four Noble Truths, that we shouldn't cling to our aggregates that we call ourself, and that we, there is a way of ending suffering, but it is not through clinging. So then that goes on into the third noble truth, that there is actually an end of craving, and the Eightfold Path, which, we know to be right livelihood, right action, all of those right behaviors. So I think I'll bring this part to a close so that we can actually converse about it.